First Kings and Second Kings were originally one book. Our current Bible splits it up, similar to First Samuel and Second Samuel, and First Chronicles and Second Chronicles. Second Kings is the sequel, the finishing of the story, and it picks up right where First Kings left off, with Elijah, the prophet. Now Elijah the prophet has gotten old in his years, and God has given his understudy, his second in command, his replacement prophet, Elisha. It drives me nuts that it's Elijah and Elisha. I'm not a very smart man, and a lot of times I get them confused, and I can't remember which one's which. But Elisha is the replacement, the new guy. Now, 2 Kings tells us the story of Elijah coming to the end of his life. He's about to pass on to heaven. His time on earth is over, and Elisha is preparing to take over. Now, Elisha comes to Elijah and gives him a request. He says, when you die, I want a second portion. I want a double portion of what you've got. Your spirit doubled in me. Now, it's a big ask because we talked about last week of how powerful Elijah was and all the great things he did. You know, this is the guy that slaughtered 450 prophets of Baal and proclaimed God's name and called down fire from heaven and all these great miraculous things. And he tells him, if you see me when I die, when I leave, if you see God take me away, it'll be yours. We fast forward a little bit, and Elijah and Elisha are together, and the heavens open up, and the Spirit of God comes down in a fiery chariot and picks up Elijah and takes him off to heaven without perishing. One of only two men to die without, or one of the only two men to go to heaven without dying, rather. And Elisha sees it. And he receives the double portion. In fact, it tells us throughout the time of Elisha, he did 14 miracles we have recorded. 14 miraculous things that occurred under his watch, whereas Elijah only had 7. So he literally did have double the portion. But then the second part of 2 Kings gives us the tribe of Israel. Now remember, they were 0 for 20 with good kings, and it continues on. One king after the other, worse than the next, worse than the last. They were all bad, all turned away from God. They were evil, they were wicked, they did things that were horrendous that you can't imagine. And God sends prophets to tell them, you done messed up. You've abandoned me. You've left me, and now you're going to be taken away. And the Assyrians come in, and they take captive of the tribe of Israel, the nation of Israel. Judah doesn't fare much better. King after king does bad. And then they have a couple good kings. They have Hezekiah, who comes in and gets rid of all the evil and the wicked, and he turns to God, and things go great. And then you have Manasseh, his son. He comes in and he's wicked. In fact, it tells us that there are no king more wicked than him. This guy even brought in child sacrifice. I mean, this guy was a bad dude. But then his son Josiah comes in, and Josiah leads, and he brings the people back to God. In fact, while he's bringing the people back to God, one of the priests finds a scroll. The Old Testament law, the Torah, the rules and regulations, and Josiah's like, holy cow, why have we not been following these? This is what we need to follow if we want to get God's blessing. And so he changes everything. But then they turn back to evil. They turn back to wicked. And before long, God calls down punishment. The Babylonians come in and they take them captive. Now we're going to learn about the Babylonian captivity later on. As we go through the Bible, the prophets talk about the captivity. The bottom line is this: they were wicked, and God turned away from them. In fact, I think those are the two key verses in 2 Kings. The first comes from chapter 17, verses 22 through 23. It says, the people of Israel walked in all the sins that Jeroboam did. Remember how bad Jeroboam was. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel from his sight, as he had spoken by all his servants and the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. And then we flip back over to 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 26 and 27. It says, "Still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also from my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will cast off this city that I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house of which I said, my name shall be there." Israel and Judah were given choices. Follow God or not follow God. Do what you want to do or do what God wants you to do. Both nations chose what they wanted to do as a whole. That's not to say that Judah didn't have some good kings. Hezekiah and Josiah were great examples of what it meant to be a follower of God and a true king and to lead the people. But as a whole, they failed. They failed miserably. Remember back in Deuteronomy when Moses gave the command for the people, half of you go up on one mountain, half of you go on the other, half of you cast out the rules and the regulations and the laws and say what the blessings are going to be, and the other half, you guys say what the curses are going to be. And then you got men like Joshua giving out the charge. Choose this day who you shall serve. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. Well, Israel and Judah both choose to serve other than the Lord. And they failed. And God wiped them out. Washed them away. I'm done. I'm over it. Remember in Genesis we talked about the great flood. God said, I'm done with this. I wish I hadn't created these people. I'm causing a flood. I'm going to wipe out this generation. But he spared Noah and his family. God made a promise to David. He said, there's always going to be a line of yours on the throne. Well, how can that be if God has cast out Judah and he's cast out Israel and there's no more line of David? We need to fast forward about 40 years. The last paragraph of 2 Kings. All the people have been taken away to Babylon. The Babylonians have taken them captive. They've taken the wise men. They've taken the royals. They've taken all the gold, all the silver, all the plunder. They've taken all the warriors. They've taken everything of worthwhile. And they cast who would be the king, Jehoiakim, into prison. And the last paragraph gives us this. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him, and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, according to his daily needs, as long as he lived. And it may not seem like that's a very important paragraph. It may seem like in the grand scheme of the Bible, that's not a big deal. But it is. Because even though God's wrath burned against Judah, even though God's wrath burned against Israel, at the end of the day, when they were at their lowest, when they had nothing left in the tank, when they were done, they were beaten, they were cast out and taken captive by these two nations, God looked down upon his servant, Jehoiakim, a line of David, and he blessed him. Even though we may run into issues, we may run into failures, even though we may run into trials and tribulations, God has not left us. Even though he may get ticked, even though he may want to cause a flood, even though he may want to wipe us out, his blessing and his love is on us forever. If we choose to serve him this day. Now there's another issue or topic that I want to cover in 2 Kings that I kind of brushed over. King Josiah. We think of kings as being these wise old men that are are in age and they've been warriors, they've been soldiers, they've grown up in the palace, they know how things work, things are going great. They're powerful men. Josiah was a boy, 8 years old. I was a youth minister for 12 years and I work a lot with kids. I don't know of any 8-year-old that I'd want to make president of the United States of America. But the king that brought Judah back to what they needed to be, who they needed to be, who they were, who brought the scroll of the Torah back into the house of God and said, this is who we are, this is what we're going to follow, was a boy, a child. Now, it's not just there that we learn of great faith coming from children. Jesus himself talked about little children. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 13 through 15, Jesus says this, "Then the children were brought to him, that he may lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples rebuked the people, but Jesus said, 'Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for such belongs to the kingdom of heaven.' And he laid his hands on them and went away." And just a few chapters before that, in Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 4, he says this, "At the time the disciples came to Jesus, saying, 'Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them, and said, 'Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven.'" What does it mean to have childlike faith? I hear that all the time in Christian circles of, got to have faith like a little child. My mom likes to tell a story of my first hit in baseball. I get the hit, and instead of running to first base, I skipped all the way to first base. It used to drive me nuts hearing her say that, because it was an embarrassment. Who skips to first base? But anybody that knows me knows how much I love the game of baseball. There is no greater game ever created by God or Abner Doubleday. By skipping to first base, it was pure joy. It was excitement. It was love. It was carefree. That's how we need to be with God. We need to be so in love, so enamored, so carefree, like a little kid, that we skip all around town. That we get like David when the Ark of the Covenant came back into Jerusalem. He didn't care what anybody thought. That he went running down the street in his underwear. Now, I'm not saying that we should run around the street in our underwear, skipping and shouting joys. But I am saying we need to have faith like a little kid. To have joy. To have exuberance. To have enthusiasm. To have a carefree attitude of trust. That's what I love about little kids. You can tell them anything and they're going to believe you. They're going to follow you. They're going to do what you want them to do because they don't know any better. That's what made Josiah successful. He heard what he needed to hear about God and his love. And he said, I don't care about anything else. This is all I need. So as we go throughout the week, the months, the years, the rest of our lives, quit acting like an adult. The adults messed everything up. The grown men ruined it for Israel. They ruined it for Judah. But a little kid showed them what life was all about. Following God and not caring about anything else in the world. Now, next week is Easter Sunday. I'm going to pause. Well, not really pause. I'm going to shift around our study. We've been going through the books of the Bible in order, as they're in our Bible. not chronological order, but in order of what's in our Bible. So we should be on First Chronicles, but we're not going to go to First Chronicles. We're going to skip ahead to Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah's book. So if you're reading along like you're supposed to be doing, read Isaiah. It is really, really long. There's a whole lot of words there, but there's a whole lot of good information there. And oddly enough, it fits perfectly with Easter. Have a great week.